Right, that's part of it. Uh, and I want to see if you catch another difference. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we are saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with groans too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. We know that all things, even suffering, work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn within a large family. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Do you notice a difference there? It's mostly the same, actually, very close.
But it's pretty gender neutral, as
Yeah,
opposed to the RSV version, which is very masculine.
right. Yeah. So I know Paul Holloway, that would have been that's a very conscious choice on his part to avoid the kind of hypergendered language. Anything else? There's a word that keeps getting repeated, that groaning. So it starts out with the groaning in labor pains. Then it talks about us groaning inwardly while we wait for adoption. And then in verse 26, we're used to hearing the Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. But that's the same word as groans. It's the same Greek word. So I don't know why the translators have chosen to shift in the middle of this passage from groans to sighs, because it's the same word.
Ah. Groaning sounds a lot worse.
Yeah, it's a little more severe than sigh.
Right.
How loud you sigh.
Right.
Right.
The older I get, the more I sigh, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
I can always tell when my upstairs neighbor is here, because he always just moans off and on. It's the weirdest sound, and I don't know, moan and groan and sigh. This is more of a groan, I think. So I don't know why they would use a difference there. You don't have any idea?
I really don't know. I mean, I think what might have happened along the way, this is just speculation, I don't know. But I think what might have happened is that at some point in English, it was translated to sighs, maybe across the board. And it felt so poetic or right. It was memorable. The Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. I mean, it's a poetic and memorable kind of phrase. So maybe it just stuck. Maybe it felt so familiar that they didn't want to change it back to what it actually says, which is groans. But I don't know.
But groans too deep for words, that has to me more impact than sighs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you're right, it's not as poetic.
Yeah. No, it's It's an interesting choice.
Hmm.
In my mind, it was always, in my St. Joseph, the New American Bible uses groan consistently. And in my mind, the groan of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit himself makes intercession for us with groaning that cannot be expressed in speech, that the groaning represented this deep-seated anxiety about not finding the right words to come into the presence of God. And so that the prayer becomes a groan of need, if that makes sense, a groan that had no words to express it other than, I don't have the words, please give them to me. That's kind of that's how I always interpret it. And it was a painful thing, the inability to find the right words, because we're not capable of it on our own. And that's kind of how I always perceive that.
Hi, Kay.
Hi, I'm sorry I got an important phone call. I hope it's okay to come late.
We're
Yes.
glad you're here now. We're looking at
Thank you.
Romans chapter 8, verses
Okay.
15 to 30. It's a slightly expanded version of what's in the lectionary. We're just getting a little
Okay.
more on the front and the back.
Well, I printed out the lectionary this morning, but this goes beyond.
Yeah, just
You're
more in front
It
of it.
starts early and goes long.
okay.
You know what Mary Lou said about not having the words, so you groan, and this is a childish thing, but I remember reading one time about a child that mother said, say your prayers, and she started saying ABCs, and she said, why are you saying the ABCs? And she said, because I don't know what words to use, but I know God will know. So just I'm giving him the alphabet.
Well, how wise was that?
I know.
Out of the mouths of babes.
Exactly.
Well, the other
And
thing,
I often feel that way of not knowing how to express myself when I want to pray for something.
Mhm.
We lost Madeline. What happened to Madeline?
I'm coming back. I'm listening.
Okay.
the
I'm
other thing
finishing my
about,
lunch.
Oh, you're still eating.
I just realized I hadn't eaten it all.
the other
Sorry.
thing, the groans, that's kind of interesting rather than the sighs. I mean, I think we really should stick with groans, because where that image starts is in verse 22. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in what? Verse 22.
We know that all of the creation groans and is in agony even until now.
Mhm.
See, that's
Right.
Have groaning and travail together until now.
Shadow. Mhm.
what does yours say, Deb?
We know that the whole creation has been groaning in travail together until now.
Travail is
Or your version has labor pains.
labor pains. Yeah. Which is what it means. I mean, it literally means that it's the word for the pains of a woman giving birth, for
Right.
labor. Travail is a nice old-fashioned word for that, but it is labor pains. I don't know many women who just sort of sigh through labor.
Nope.
I think,
No, I don't think that's appropriate unless you're under anesthesia.
I think most people are on the groan end of the sigh groan spectrum during the moment of labor. So what does that say to us? I mean, that's sort of the keystone of this passage, that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now.
Waiting for Jesus.
Yeah.
There's been an absence of spirit and hope, maybe.
Mhm.
And then it goes on to say, and we ourselves
Mhm.
who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly while we wait for adoption.
Yeah.
So we're groaning too,
Mm-hmm.
along with the whole creation.
So that's interesting, because who the we ourselves in that verse, who do you think that refers to?
All humanity.
Mhm.
I
Well,
would
but
take-
these are the ones with the first fruits of the Spirit. So that would
Yeah.
be the Christians, the early Christians then.
I think
that's
it's
Yes.
what I took it.
Yeah.
I think it's probably, I think Caroline is right, where it's the believers. I mean, the people who have,
Mhm.
at this point, it's still probably too early to even say the early Christians,
Right.
the believers,
Followers of Jesus.
yeah, um, are the ones who have the first fruits of the Spirit. Now, that's an interesting phrase too, because there's another word that means, like, we talk about the fruits of the Spirit, right? There's a whole list of the fruits of the Spirit. But this is different. This is not those things. These are the first fruits of the Spirit. So in a way, the emphasis is on first fruits. In the same way, it comes from the harvest rituals of ancient Israel, where the farmers would harvest their wheat or slaughter their sheep or something, and the very first produce was taken to the temple and sacrificed to God. So it's about us being the kind of first, being returned back to God in a way, being sort of given back to God from creation, if that makes sense. That we are the first fruits of the Spirit, or have the first fruits of the Spirit. Does that make sense?
Expound on that just a little bit. So is it, you said like it's what you give back? I mean, that's like sacrifices and that kind of thing?
Yes, it's what's been sacrificed back to God are the first fruits.
Okay.
And
Or
so,
tithe back.
The tithing.
Yeah, the first.
right, like tithing is connected to that. Yeah, the
Okay.
all the stuff that you produce in this life, part of that, the first part.
Giving it back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
it's
we don't.
this language about childhood, because there's childbirth, there's also adoption.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You wait for adoption, and to be, I love this too. Where did it go? Verse 29, talking about the Son, and Paul calls Jesus the firstborn within a large family.
Mm.
So that everyone is being adopted with Christ as the Son of God. We are being adopted into the family of God, the Creator.
So do you have to be baptized for that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think theologically, the way we would answer that now is yes. To be, I mean, that's one of the things that we say about baptism is you're being adopted into the household of God, right? The family of God. That's different from the question of, to be saved, do you have to be baptized? Right? Which I think
I've never worried about that.
Which, right, but I think many people worry about that more than the sort of adoption piece.
Well, the adoption piece is interesting to me, because everywhere else, when you hear this talk, we are children of God.
Mm-hmm.
That there's not an adoption piece in it, but that we are actually all made in the image of God. And so I'm wondering where Paul is coming from with this concept.
Mhm.
Adopted people are children of their parents, so I don't see a lot of difference.
Except that it's, well, okay. I see your point, Madeline, and I
Yeah.
agree, but it's just such a different language.
Right.
it's
I
hard
think
to-
you're onto something, Deb. And I think what it has to do with is part of Paul's larger point. He starts this passage that we're looking at in verse 18. One of the things that he talks about is the glory about to be revealed to us. And then in verse 30, he finishes up, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. So part of this for Paul is about the glory of the risen Jesus. This is very much centered in not so much in the life and ministry of Jesus, because Paul didn't see that, right? Paul was not around for that. Paul's encounter is with the risen, resurrected Jesus who sort of manifests, right, on the road to Damascus, manifests spiritually and is present that way, but already as the risen, glorified Jesus. And so I think the adoption piece, it's saying that, you know, as natural children of God, if you will, which we all are. I mean, I think you could say that. We have not yet been glorified. That's why we're still groaning, right? We have not been finally, ultimately assumed into the glory of the resurrection. And that's kind of what the adoption is getting at. Does that make sense?
I think
Yeah.
so.
I mean, it's not perfect. It's not like a one-to-one metaphor or symbolism. This is, you know, part of Paul's rhetorical strategy. He's making a specific point and he's preaching. I mean, that's really what it is. You know, something that you say in a sermon at one point is not always going to be the same point or the same illustration that you use in another time or context.
Right.
What are the other things that stick out to you about this passage? Anything that surprised you or?
Pretty familiar.
Yeah, it's one of those kind of highlight passages, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think so.
I think one thing that's interesting about this, and maybe we can talk about it for a while because it's kind of complicated and I haven't thought all the way through it, is the sense of time with this. There's things that are happening that have happened in the past, things that are continuing to happen from the past to the present. There are things that are going on into the future or things that will happen. So like what's our current condition? What's our present?
You're talking about right now?
Yeah,
Present?
let's assume
Today?
that Paul was writing this to us.
Well, as it's immediately prior to Pentecost, then I'd say we were, you know, in the verse 23, 24, that kind of area where we're waiting for adoption. We're waiting for the Spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're waiting. We're definitely in a state of waiting. And then in verse 18, you know, at the beginning, it says that this present time, the sufferings of this present time. So it's the sufferings and the moanings and the groanings and the sighing and all that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's plenty of that right now.
Yeah.
Amen.
It's you know, it's not a specifically Christian idea. I think that's part of just wisdom in many religions. Like the first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is suffering, right? That life is suffering. I mean, as Christians, we believe in redemption, and salvation. But I think we also have to be honest, and Paul is honest about the fact that, yeah, it ain't always great. We're waiting, we're groaning, we're suffering. It's not been fully accomplished yet.
Well, I think it's interesting in 24, where it talks about hope. Now, hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what is seen. But if we wait for hope, but if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Well, I'm not very patient.
Most humans
And
are.
it's been 2,000 years.
I know. That's what that word patience jumped out at me. And I thought, well, I haven't learned that yet.
Yeah, the Greek gets a little squirrely in verses 24 and 25, because like, now hope that is seen is not hope. What that really means is, like the substance, what we hope for, not hope itself. Does that make sense? I mean, it's just a kind of squirrely little thing. Greek.
Hope.
And is that really alluding to the second coming, or is it alluding to the actual coming of the Spirit?
I think it's a second coming more than an idea of Pentecost. I think it's a second kind of idea.
Because it's Paul writing, and he's already experienced the Holy Spirit.
Right. And he would say that for the other people in this community, that they already are, that they've already received the Spirit. Now, the very beginning of verse 24 is another one of those places where I think the time and the tense of this is really interesting, because it says, well, what do your translations say? The first sentence in verse 24.
For in this hope we are saved.
Okay, we are.
Mine says we're saved.
We're
Not are saved, but we're saved. Yeah.
Mine says have been saved.
have been.
A lot of difference.
You're
Tenses.
right. I misread it.
Tenses.
Which one does yours say, Deb?
Were.
Were, and have been. What about Mary?
Mine's were.
Were. Okay, which one do you have?
I have the NRSV.
And does it say are saved or were saved or have been?
Were.
Yeah.
Which says, does that say we're already redeemed?
Right. The way that is in the Greek, the tense in the Greek is what's called the aorist, aorist. There's no reason you need to know this, really. I mean, technically, except that what the aorist means is that it happened one time, like once upon a time, this happened. So one day we were saved. It's not we are being saved, or it's not even we have been saved, because that says, it's sort of a continuing process. But it's we were saved or are saved. I mean, you could argue either one for were or are, but it just means that it happened at a given point in time, and it's been accomplished, it's been done, which is
Once and for all.
Yeah, once and for all, which is weird in this moment, because Paul normally talks about salvation being in the future. It's something that we are still waiting on, right? I mean, there's a little bit of a both and with that in this passage.
And Paul usually implies that there's some action on our part involved, as opposed to, the crucifixion and the resurrection being that, you know, grace that saved us, he usually includes what we have to do.
Mhm. Are there any other thoughts about that? I mean, I think it's an important part of this passage because it is unusual. I mean, it's unusual for Paul to talk about salvation in the past tense. Maybe it's something about hope too. Maybe it's trying to be really specific about the kind of salvation that we already have. That's manifested in our hope. I mean, the world, the creation, doesn't on its own give us much cause for hope, right? I mean, there's lots of really troubling things that just continue to happen. And so, you know, if you're watching CNN all day, you're not going to have much cause for hope from the creation itself. But part of our salvation, I think, is what Paul is saying is this hope that we have within us that would come from the Spirit.
This may be a little off the subject, but what often worries me is when we say one baptism, that to me, that's leaving out a lot of civilization that's not baptized.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't accept the fact that only Christians are going to go to heaven. I just can't do that. And so I don't like to get too specific as far as we're the only people that are going to go, the only people that are saved. And I don't like that word saved anyway, but.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a really important question, and something that has to be kind of theologized out. Now, what I think about that, and I think this is kind of where Paul is, you know, for him, the whole creation, we see it in this passage, the whole creation is being saved, is being redeemed.
Well, that's encouraging.
Well, and I think even further, if you consider the major religions of the world come down to two basic tenets: love your God, or whatever that figure is, and love one another.
Love your neighbor as yourself. Right.
And I believe that God will try and come to us in any way that we can. So if it's in the form of Buddhism, or if it's in the form of Islam or Judaism, I mean, I think that's all one God.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was Paul who said, in Christ, there is no Jew nor Greek, you know. There is no pagan versus, I think you could phrase it that way. There is no pagan versus monotheist. There is no, you know, it's for him, although he is clear about our preaching the gospel. I mean, he wants the good news to get out there.
Sure.
But that's a different kind of thing than, you know, are all these people who don't hear it or don't receive it or don't believe it, are they going to be cast into hell? I mean, that's you know, that's more Dante than it is New Testament, really. I mean, that's really true. Our imagination, and it's a Western thing, it's not so much even an Eastern Orthodox thing. Our imagination has been so shaped by these more kind of popular notions of heaven and hell, and the idea of a devil and stuff like that, you know, a guy with red horns and a pitchfork. Our ideas have been shaped so much by that on this issue rather than scripture itself.
It seems to me that no matter what your religion is, even if you pretend you don't have any religion, everybody has hope. But for a greater power, for a greater something that's going to be good. One of the lines in a prayer I was reading this morning was, speaking of God, you fill us with a fullness and hope that we will never comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that when I read it, and I think, what does that really mean? But I do think that we all have hope
Mm-hmm.
for better things. I don't know if that has anything to do with this or not, but it seems to me.
I think it's very directly connected to it. I think that's right. Yeah.
I still default to my little girl catechism that I found in the archive as I was unpacking. And one day I'll hold it up so you can all see it. It's a great treasure from my first communion in 1952. At any rate, the first line is, why did God make you? Well, he made me in the image and likeness of God. And so, and this line has frequently represented to me a message saying, hope exists in each other and you don't see it because everyone, and obviously I fail and do not see it, but everyone with whom we encounter is made in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, hope exists. Hope is not a hope if its object is seen. How is it possible for one to hope for what he sees? Like, it's in front of you, people, was kind of the message to me. It's that I live in each of you and you don't see me. And so that is the hope that I extract from this passage.
Yeah, I really like that. I hadn't heard that take, but I really like that. And I do think that Paul in this section of Romans is very much thinking about, all humanity and all creation and the image of God. I mean, he's talking about how we've been created in the image of God. And then we've had the fall. I mean, the fall is part of this too. But there is that hope that carries us forward. Yeah.
I think our society has so often limited hope for others if they didn't believe like we did, and that's what I have so much trouble with, is wanting everybody to toe the line exactly like everybody else, particularly now in our fundamentalist era. That it's very disturbing to me that we want everybody to think alike and be alike and look alike too.
It's one of my whipping horses, Caroline, because you're exactly right. And one of the places that people reach for who want to do that is the letters of Paul. They're always turning back to Paul. When I find every time I read Paul that he is constantly making points about tolerating diversity. He said it's not only Jew, Greek, female, male, free, slave. It's not only all those things, but it's also within the community of believers. It's what this language of the strong and the weak that shows up in Romans and also in the Corinthians correspondence. Now that's a kind of hairy topic in and of itself, but the basic point is you need to tolerate a diversity of viewpoints within your own community.
Yeah.
It ties to the whole gifts of the Spirit, and that we all have different ones.
Right.
And if we all had the same ones, we wouldn't be able to function as God intended us to function.
Yeah, a diversity of gifts in one Spirit. Yeah, absolutely.
Can you imagine the rivalry if we all had the same gifts?
Right.
Have to one up everybody else.
Yep. And then, the other thing, I mean, Paul is always making that point about diversity sort of internal and external to the community, this diversity. He's a real pragmatist about it too. I mean, you know, at some basic levels, Paul is saying, don't be a jerk. Like, live peaceably with your neighbors. You know, you can get along with people of all different sorts of things. You can go and eat with the people of a different religion. It doesn't matter. You can go and enjoy being in a relationship with those people. And at the same time, Paul does say things like, well, this is Ephesians, so it's probably not authentic Paul, but it's ascribed to Paul, the one Spirit. And then at the beginning of Romans, when he talks about all have fallen short of the glory of God. So he also says there are some things that are just true about the human condition. Yes, we're all different, but there are some things that we all share. We all share in suffering, and we all share in hope, you know. So unfortunately, Paul gets a really bad rap. And
He gets a bad rap from women because of obeying your husbands and that kind of thing. That's,
Yes.
you know.
which, guess what, Caroline? The New Testament scholars have told us wasn't actually written by Paul.
Oh, really?
Now, I'm not saying that Paul was, you know, a
Didn't
member
agree.
of the National Organization for Women or anything like that. I mean, he's a guy from antiquity, but he did not write that stuff. I mean, I think, and people who read the New Testament critically would agree. I mean, pretty much.
I've never heard that.
Well, but he also, he's advising people of how they should conduct themselves given the mores of the time.
Right.
And that gets lost a lot. And even amongst, you know, the churches that he's talking to, there are a lot of progressive churches that have a lot of women in leadership.
Oh yeah. I mean, probably the person, I mean, a lot of people think that the person in charge of actually reading Romans to the Roman church, to the group of people at Rome, was probably Phoebe, a woman. You know, I mean, Paul had no problem with women in leadership.
Yeah.
I think it's clear. He's always writing to women. He's always saying, you know, greet so and so and such a person because we're, you know, we have this connection or this experience in the past and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think that Paul, especially for his time, is remarkably not sexist in an unusual way. I mean, I think it's pretty remarkable, actually.
Well, he started as a Pharisee. I mean, he's had a lot of transformation.
Yeah, he started as a Pharisee, and he was kind of educated in the philosophy called Stoicism, you know, which is that whole idea of basically regulating your own emotions and feelings. Don't give in to kind of temptation and pleasure, but be it. And it is it's a masculine kind of honor-based philosophy of, you know, you have to be strong and independent, and you can't succumb to temptation. So that's part of Paul as well. But yeah, I mean, he's a complicated figure, but I think all too often he gets a bad rap. He really does.
I'm glad to hear that because he hasn't been on my favorite list.
Well, you know, I mean, so just basic background knowledge. There are all these letters, the epistles that are ascribed to Paul, and scholars have figured out pretty clearly which ones he actually wrote. You know, they think, and that's. Let me see if I can get them all. First Thessalonians, maybe Second Thessalonians, but probably not. First Thessalonians, Galatians, First and Second Corinthians. Although Second Corinthians has one of those famous passages, and scholars have surmised that this was added in later. That's the wives be obedient to your husbands passage. That was pasted in after Paul was on.
Cut and paste.
Romans, Philemon or Philemon. Now that one's problematic because it's about slavery, right? I mean, he's and
Yeah, that was the other one.
slaves, that's true, and that's obviously a problem for us. At least I hope so. I hope it's a problem.
It was certainly used to justify slavery.
Yes, it was. And then Colossians, people waver on. I tend to think it probably was not Paul, but some people say it was. Anyway. Yeah.
Well, and even the ones that are questionable were probably written by people that worked with and for Paul. So it would be like a student following a professor's research after the professor has gone on or no longer professes.
They
Right.
don't always agree. I mean, they may.
Yeah.
No, they may come down, they may slide some of their own thoughts in, which would be
Yeah.
some of the diversity.
Right.
Now the interesting thing too, I'll just add this as a footnote because Caroline has brought these things up, and it's true. I mean, it's a big part of understanding Paul. Those so-called clobber passages or clobber verses about wives be obedient to your husbands, that kind of thing. Slaves, obey your masters. Those chunks, if you will, you can lift them out of Jewish sources, out of pagan sources, out of Stoic philosophical sources. There's something that we call the household codes. And it was pretty much across the religious board in Paul's context, the ancient Near East. Anybody would say that. That had nothing to do with Christianity or Judaism. I mean, that was just what the culture told you. So I think that speaks to the argument that even if Paul's life may have looked like that from the outside in some ways, or people wanted Paul to say these things, I don't think he actually wrote them. They could have been cut and pasted from the first century version of Emily Post.
Well, and it's not that different than what Jesus said about rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's. I mean, in terms of, the cultural norms and the spiritual norms.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus is not exactly, not many people think this way. Not many Christians in our own context think this way, but Jesus isn't exactly the sort of family values guy that people make him out to be.
He's pulling people from their parents.
Exactly. What does he say about your parents? You can't follow me if you don't hate your father and your mother. Now, we also know that Jesus liked to use exaggeration, but, Jesus is he really is not a family values guy the way we conceive of family values in the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's just not. So, and I don't think Paul was either. Some of the people who came after Paul, yeah, definitely. But I don't think Paul was either. Are there any reactions to that kind of stuff? Or
I'm just glad we're an accepting congregation and have a broad base for the church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I should say, just because Jesus used those hyperboles, and I don't think Paul was the family values guy, I'm not saying that you should actually hate your own parents,
No,
your children should hate you, or that you should hate your brother and sister, or anything like that.
we're not going to go out and spread that rumor.
No.
Ryan said.
Right. Would you believe that?
Right.
What Ryan said?
Father Ryan said.
Yeah, I have to be careful.
Shout, shout.
It's recorded and goes on YouTube, so people
Oh, gosh.
take
Oh.
context. But yeah.
Well, that's the joy of being a part of the Anglican Communion and being able to talk about things that might be viewed as heresy in other more fundamental denominations.
Right.
You know, and the idea that, you know, God didn't tell us not to think. He gave us a brain, so we should use it.
Yeah, I might have mentioned this to this group the last time we were together, but I recently saw my good friend and mentor Neil Alexander. Yeah, I did mention this, Caroline, because I remember he was in Atlanta when you were. But we sort of agreed that one of the hallmarks of Anglicanism is a kind of inbuilt agnosticism. You know, that there are just certain things that we don't have to accept a simple reductive answer. We can sort of tolerate mystery. We can tolerate a little vagueness. We can tolerate just not knowing the answer sometimes, which I think is good. I think that's a big part of why I can feel it in the Episcopal Church. All right, we're getting down to the end of the time, and part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this lesson today is because on Sunday in the afternoon, we are going to be doing something I think pretty important and pretty remarkable at the churchyard when we are reinterring the remains of an enslaved person from this place. And this passage, I think, just spoke to me because it talks so richly about suffering and having to wait and having dreams and hopes that aren't realized, as well as the hope that sort of keeps us going. So I wonder, you know, if you have just any thoughts about that as we're getting ready to sort of remember a human being who was enslaved and brutalized in this place that we call home.
It's really more than one, isn't it? I mean, I thought that
It sounds like it, yeah.
Penny had a fabulous post on Facebook this morning. If you haven't seen it, she wrote up the whole thing. And
Well, it was from the county. That
Yeah,
was her.
Susie
Yeah.
said,
well, she posted it. That's what
Right.
I'm saying. And if you haven't seen it, that would be a good place to look.
Right.
And it was a good explanation about it. But I thought I read that they had been interred once, maybe twice before, and the bones had gotten mixed. So, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Did I misinterpret that?
No,
that's what it said.
Yeah,
I think it's more than one person.
But the disturbing thing to me was this started in 2006.
Yeah, just now getting it done.
Yeah,
Terrible.
and you know, the backstory, I think, is that they discovered these, they wanted to study them, they wanted to do the right thing with these remains. So they sort of waited around on the study. They had a funeral home person who was sort of put in charge of, well, he died, that person died, and the business closed down. And then I think the county administrators and the coroner, you know, we have a new county coroner, I think it just was not a priority probably. So that's why it's taken this long. And then
Well, was
county,
Holy Cross asked to do this by the county, or how did we get involved?
yes, the county approached us
Good.
about that. And part of that is because that we know that, you know, ours is a historically African-American cemetery, and
Mhm.
pretty confident that there are formerly enslaved people who are
Right.
so it does make some historical sense, and I'm glad that we get the opportunity to be part of that.
Mhm.
I think it's wonderful.
I do too. I do too.
Well, and Will had mentioned when he first told me about this, that there's the possibility of some kind of a shrine or a monument or some commemoration for enslaved people. And that the plat that they're using is at the very front of the cemetery, closest to 17. Am I right on that, Ryan?
I don't know about the second part. That sounds like it is true, but I just don't know. The first part, yeah, I think that's the longer term goal. Would there would be some monument, something more substantial than just like a gravestone or something like that.
Will there be other clergy? Will there be any African American clergy involved?
Yeah,
Yes.
Will and I will sort of, hosting in a way, and it will be framed within the kind of within the Episcopal burial liturgy, but there will probably at the end of the day be a lot more words from some of the Black clergy leaders from Georgetown and around here. Yeah, they're very much involved, and the county has been involved in preparing the ceremony and everything too. So it's been a collaborative process.
Good.
Will also said that the ceremony would not be more than 45 minutes as per the county, which will be interesting to see if that's
Adhered to.
That's
yeah.
principle. We will hope for that. Yeah.
We will, but wear comfortable shoes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
He
is
said-
everything at the cemetery?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Is everything going to occur at the cemetery?
I believe so. We have a meeting with the county people about logistics tomorrow. But yeah, I think the whole thing is planned there at the site in the cemetery. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but that's where I've imagined it happening. I'm sure that will be communicated. Yeah.
And I'm sure they'll get us across the highway safely, hopefully.
Yeah, they're gonna work on that. One of the other interesting little historical footnotes about this is that the chapel, so there was St. Mary's Chapel on the side of the Hagley plantation, which is where these remains were discovered. That chapel has been gone for a long time. But they think these remains came from the churchyard at St. Mary's Chapel. St. Mary's Chapel was designed and built by an enslaved person named Renty Tucker. He was apparently he does something of an architect. He also designed the Pelican Inn.
Right.
Designed and built.
There's a book about him. There's a book about Renty Tucker. Yeah.
I just discovered this, and I want to read the book. And then another place that he designed is what used to be St. Cyprian's Episcopal Church in Georgetown. Y'all probably know St. Cyprian's now is the historically Black Roman Catholic Church in Georgetown. But before that parish came into being, there was the St. Cyprian's Episcopal Church, which you may have noticed this building in downtown Georgetown. It still exists. It's a little blue clapboard structure on Duke Street, just like a block or so, kind of catty corner to Prince George, on the other side, on the reverse side, kind of. But it still exists, and it was only recently, it was sold about 20 years ago by the Episcopal Diocese, and part of me says, maybe we should buy that back, since we're not going to get Prince George back in the settlement. An Episcopal presence in Georgetown might be very happy at that structure.
Right.
And the other thing, and then we can go, is that the east window, the window behind the altar at Prince George, came from St. Mary's Chapel, where these remains were buried. There's part of me that has this really probably sinful desire
I
to
know what you're going to say.
It's human.
really antagonize the Prince George people and say, wouldn't it be lovely, since you have this beautiful window, if you would, contribute to this monument or something like that. So I'll have to consider that one. Or it's sort of above my pay grade, but
I thought it was amazing that the chapel at Hagley was so beautifully built and had stained glass windows. I guess I
Yeah.
just felt like that wouldn't have happened back then for a slave church, but obviously it did. I think it's remarkable.
I've seen sketches of it.
Mhm.
I don't think it was a picture. I think it was just sketches of the church.
Is
But
that in
it was
his book,
beautiful.
maybe?
It was beautiful. I'll have to look through some of my stuff and see if I've got it.
Have you got a copy of that book, Caroline?
I do. I
Would
do.
you be able to borrow it at some point? I would love.
will.
I don't know where I could get my hands on it. You know, I looked.
Well, no, I'll be happy. I'll try to find it and bring it to you.
Yeah, I'd love to look at it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. That it may be in that book. That may be where the sketch of
That's
St.
what I
Mary's
was
is, because
thinking.
I
I
know
bet
I've
that's
seen
what
it.
it's for.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, folks. So it's 5 after, so we'll get going here. But I enjoyed today. I always like talking about Romans. So this,
Success.
and I hope to see all of you on Sunday, whether it's for church and the picnic and the any of all the things that are happening this Sunday. So until then, let's close as we normally do. By praying in the words which Jesus Christ himself has taught us. Our Father,
Our Father, who art
Lord in heaven, hallowed be thy
in thy
name.
name, thy kingdom come,
Um,
thy thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
we bread,
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses,
trespass
as
against
we
us,
forgive those
and lead us not into temptation,
in temptation, but
deliver
deliver
us
us from evil.
thine is
For
the
thine is
kingdom,
the kingdom
power,
and the power and the glory
forever and ever.
forever. Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ryan.
Y'all
Bye,
have a
all.
lovely
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks.